Zelaznuts. This special episode of the DickHeads podcast is brought to you by the coronavirus, which is why we are not all in the same room. We are social distancing because we kind of have to. This is the cursed episode of the DickHeads podcast, the very last of the 60s Hugo series. And we did not save the best for last. But for whatever reason, we meant to record this episode 3 months ago. And first, we had a member of our team get sick. And then once we were all healthy, we wanted to record this a couple weeks ago. And then a pandemic broke out. So here we are by video talking about Roger Zelazny's two Hugo Award winning books from the 60s, which unfortunately for Mark Conlan, he volunteered to read and do for the podcast with me. And it should be noted that we both read these books last year. Well, we're recording this in March. So joining me tonight is Mark Conlan. Mark, can you remind our listeners who you are? You're a returning guest.
I am Mark Conlan. I'm a strong reader of science fiction and crime novels, and just posted on my movie blog a whole bunch of articles about Lifetime movies, which I watched last night.
All right. The two books we're talking about tonight are This Immortal, which I do still have a copy of, that was originally titled Call Me Conrad.
And Call Me Conrad.
Yeah.
Three dots and
Call Me Conrad. This one shared the Hugo Award with Dune, which is mind-blowing. But we'll get to that in a minute. And Lord of Light, which won 2 years later. And what I think we're going to do is first talk about the Hugo field for those 2 years, and then we'll come back to the books. Because it is the most fascinating thing about this Immortal. I'm sorry, I'm going to wait for the dog to stop barking. Okay, so what's fascinating about This Immortal is that it is a co-winning Hugo Award-winning novel. There have only been a few ties in the history of the Hugos, and this is one of them. And it tied with Dune. Also nominated that year was Squares of the City by John Brunner. The first serialization of Moon is a Heart's Mistress, which would go on to win the next year because it was published slightly differently in a hardcover edition. And E. Smith's Skylark Dubuque. I don't even know how to pronounce that. Whatever. Anyways, it was a strong field that year. John Brunner's book, we talked about the field in our Dune episode. The fact that any book challenged Dune that year is incredible, considering the history that book had and how much it changed the game in science fiction. And I don't think any of us who have read This Immortal thinks, in hindsight, looking back on it, that This Immortal deserves to be even in the same category as Dune. I don't know. How do you feel, Mark, about that?
I'm still upset that in the 1984, the Album of the Year Grammy Award will show Lionel Richie for All Night Long beating out Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA and Princess Purple Rain. So that seemed part of like, at least Dune got a co-win with it.
That's true. It's like Jethro Tull winning the first best heavy metal Grammy over Metallica. It's definitely in that same vein. Yeah. So that was 1966, and it was at Tricon in Cleveland, and the Toastmaster was Isaac Asimov. So Isaac Asimov had to figure out how to share the stage between Zelazny and Herbert when they accepted the awards. I don't know if they were both there. But Lord of Light went on to win 2 years later at the Baycon in Oakland. September 2nd, 1968, and the Toastmaster that year was Robert Silverberg when Lord of Light won. Lord of Light was nominated against The Einstein Intersection by Samuel Delany, Chisthon by Piers Anthony. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I'm sure I'm not. The Butterfly Kid by Chester Anderson, and Thorns by Robert Silverberg, who was the Toastmaster that year. Now, in 1968, when Lord of Light won, Delany took home the Nebula for the Einstein intersection. And that book, kind of on the surface, is like a space opera, but being that Samuel Delany was African American and the first out African American science fiction writer, that book, The Einstein Intersection, is very much about how people who are others or different in communities kind of relate to the dominant cultural ideology. And that's kind of what The Einstein Intersection was about. And so you've got that kind of theme going against the super religious theme with Lord of Light. And Thorns, the Robert Silverberg book, was actually kind of sort of similar to, it was like a psychic vampire thing. It was about this guy who was a media mogul, and it kind of reminded me of Revelations by Barry Maltzberg, but a little bit more fantastic and space opera-ish, because it has this kind of guy who's running this kind of reality show and being a psychic vampire. So Thorns is an interesting book by Robert Silverberg, who is the Toastmaster. But in the end, Lord of Light, Roger Zelazny won that year. I don't know. Have you read any of the books in this field, Mark?
No, though I've read some of Delany's works and would be impressed even if he weren't black and gay.
Yeah, he is a great author. And certainly would like to cover Delany at some point on this podcast in an adjacent episode.
I still want to do a special edition for the pandemic and do Walter Miller's Dark Benediction.
Yeah, I know you want to do that for the coronavirus, which sounds interesting. But yeah, Delany is very interesting. He and Dick did not have a super great relationship back in the day. In fact, Dick was highly critical of Dahlgren, which is considered Delany's masterpiece. And he was not a fan.
Name one person Dick had a good relationship with.
Well, actually, he did have quite a few good relationships, and then there were a lot of people like Tim Powers, KJ Jeter, and a lot of the Bay Area writers he did have a good relationship with, but definitely not Delany, because he was super critical of his work. But, anyways, Lord of Light won in 1968. So, let's talk about Roger Zelazny, the author. He was born in 1937, and he won the Nebula 3 times, but he was nominated for the Nebula 14 times. He won the Hugo Award 6 times, but only twice for novels, these 2 times. And between 1962 and 1969, he worked for the U.S. Social Security Administration in Cleveland, Ohio. And then he moved to Baltimore, and he was working for the government during the day and writing at night. And 1965 was his first novel-length work. So he had one full-length novel before he wrote this Immortal, I believe. But this Immortal is should be interesting for DickHeads listeners, because it was originally published in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction in October and November 1965. And then it went on to be published by Ace Books, which means that it was edited in magazine format by Tony Boucher, who was, shout out to Tony, who was one of Philip K. Dick's mentors and first serious editor and member of the writers group he was a part of in Oakland. So in 1966, the paperback edition was edited by Don Wollheim, which means the two most important editors to Philip K. Dick worked on both the magazine and the paperback edition of This Immortal. So I think our listeners would be interested in that history. Um, so there were a lot of cuts made to the magazine edition. So Boucher tried to cut it down quite a bit to get it into the serialized edition. And Boucher went with Zelazny's preferred title, which was "And Call Me Conrad." And for the life of me, I can't figure out why he thought that was a great title, but that was his title. And
say,
it was Don Wollheim who never was one to let a bad title go, and retitled it This Immortal. And I thank Don for sticking to his guns on that, because that's a much better title.
I disagree.
Yeah. And,
I thought "And Call Me Conrad" was a much better title, personally.
Okay, tell me why you thought that was a better title.
Because it's a bit more ironic and a bit more mysterious, and it's, sort of invites you to read instead of basically summarizing the story. Thinks it works much better if you have to realize as you go through the book that the main character is immortal, rather than being told that on the cover page.
Okay, that's a strong argument. I hear you. I don't really know what's super inviting about "And Call Me Conrad," but it certainly doesn't sell the idea of science fiction, and I think that was probably and marketing was what Don Wollheim was probably thinking about. But I hear you. So Zelazny did say in many interviews that was his preferred title. The abridgment of the novel was 47,000 words for the magazine, and once it was restored, it was 58,000 words. And it wasn't until a book club edition that was published in the 80s that Zelazny got to put some of the full cuts, get back some of the full text that he wanted to have in it. I don't know. I read the Bain Books version, which is post book club. So my version, I think, is the preferred author edition. Although
mine's a new one that I bought on Amazon. So I
would assume that's preferred edition.
Okay.
But I think one of the cuts just came down to 10 paragraphs between one of the editions, but apparently it was very important to Zelazny to get those 10 paragraphs back. Zelazny said, and I quote, "I wanted to leave it open to several interpretations, well, at least two. I wanted to sort of combine fantasy and science fiction. Either Conrad is a mutant or he is a great god Pan. The book can be read either way." So what did you think of the story of This Immortal / And Call Me Conrad, Mark? How did you take it?
Well, I think part of the problem was I just didn't think Conrad was that interesting a character. And for a writer with Zelazny's reputation, it really came alive much more in the action scenes than anything else, even though, it's like, okay, we're in a world where everything is mutated, so you've got all these, bizarre animals popping up that the hero has to fight. But the action scenes were the parts of the book that really came alive for me. And I joked that it was like someone got Edgar Rice Burroughs' library card, steered him to the section on ancient Greek history and mythology, and said, okay, do something with this. But the fight can be very, very Burroughs-esque, but they're also the best parts of the book.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting for me because I thought that there was hints and glimmers of really interesting ideas, and it really did help me to think, as far as my overall judgment of Zelazny, that this was early in his career and only his second novel. I think that there was a lot of really, really interesting ideas that were kind of on the sidelines of this novel, but at the most part, I found it to be a lot of really good ideas that were kind of ramshackly thrown together.
Mm-hmm.
Me personally, but I mean, there was moments that I did find really really interesting. And I know you're saying the action scenes were some of your favorite parts. Was there any of the characterization of? I mean, you said that you didn't think Conrad was a very interesting character, right?
Right. I didn't think he was very interesting or very sympathetic. Zelazny, I guess, wanted to create this aura of mystery around him, but I certainly didn't think he was a god, just an ordinary human who had been born with the capability to live forever and doing it. Sort of like a serious version of the Carl Reiner Mel Brooks 2,000-year-old man.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I liked some of the post-apocalyptic setting of it, but that kind of fell away a little bit too. The more you got into the story, it's like it wasn't so important that it was just kind of like that it was like a fantasy land, but it wasn't so. I don't think he played into the fact that we're in a post-human, or human-dominated Earth, right? And we have the Vegans, which I know, we'll get to that. The
Mm-hmm.
fact that the aliens were from Vega, and so throughout the book, it was very hard for me to read all this stuff that looked like it was talking about vegans. Um, and then there are some really amusing parts of the book for me for that. But um, this conceit that the book has that Conrad is kind of giving this, or that there's this tour being given of the history of Earth to these alien visitors, I think was kind of underutilized in the book. Like it's huge and it's there, but I think it could have been neater things could have been done with it. I don't know. That's one to me one of the weaknesses. I think you're seeing a lot of signs of a young author here that's in his second novel in that regard. And in no way does this book hold anything close to a candle with Dune. It is mind-boggling that Dune, for all of its faults or pluses and minuses, ups and downs, Dune is incredible compared to this. And I can't even believe that they're even being talked about in the same sentence. I mean,
Well, Frank Herbert was writing an epic, and he had the chops to create that whole world and to write an epic length novel, whereas Zelazny was kind of stretching this out. In fact, I wondered whether I would have liked the shorter version better.
well, and that is one thing too, is that I think Herbert, even though Dune was serialized eventually in the same magazine too, the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, I believe. Um, but even though Herbert was doing that, he did not write Dune for that purpose. He originally wrote it to be an epic, huge novel, and he just had to settle for publishing it that way. Whereas I think Zelazny was probably writing with the market in mind, because he was already writing for all the magazines at that time.
And
So,
also, Herbert had quite a few more novels published by then than Zelazny had.
but I don't have a ton to say about. I know that there's some interesting things that I read on Wikipedia about. There's clues that Conrad may be the great god Pan. That Conrad's name recalls one of Pan's names, and there's all kinds of like little like Easter eggs and things in that for the great god Pan. I'm not really well versed in Pan stuff, so I didn't catch that until I was doing research. And I do think that Zelazny has a lot of really great research and mythological things that he puts into his work that definitely goes over my head. So, but that doesn't make it a better experience for me. I don't know how you feel about that stuff. And
I was
your
kind of ransacking my high school era knowledge of ancient Greek history and mythology, trying to remember, okay, what's this, what's that, what's the other. And when I read Lord of Light, I was really at sea with I felt that in order to appreciate that book, I'd really need to know a lot more about the Hindu pantheon than I ever have or really wanted to know.
Right. Well, let's talk about Lord of Light. Let's get there. 'Cause I don't think we need to make this the longest episode in the history of Dickheads, considering the books we're covering. But Lord of Light is the last of the 60s Hugo winners for me to read. And I read this just at the very end of the year, just so I could get it in before New Year's Day, so I could read all the 60s within the year. 60s Hugo winners. Originally, Lord of Light, two chapters were published as a novelette in fantasy and science fiction. So once again, Tony Boucher was involved in the editing of the early parts of these books. It appears that Zelazny published quite a bit with Boucher and crew at Fantasy and Science Fiction. And the two novelettes were called Dawn, which was published in April 1967, and Death of the Executioner, which was published in June 67. But they were not serialized or connected. They were kind of like on their own. And then within the year, he sold it to Doubleday as a hardcover, the whole thing. And Lord of Light, the way the plot is described on Wikipedia is Lord of Light is set on a planet colonized by some of the remnants of the vanished Yarath, or Earth. The crew and colonists from the spaceship Star of India found themselves on a strange planet surrounded by hostile indigenous races and had to carve a place for themselves or perish. To increase their chances of survival, the crew has used chemical treatments, biofeedback, and electronics to mutate their minds and create enhanced self-images or aspects that strengthen their bodies and intensify their wills to extend their power of their desires into attributes, blah, blah, blah. I already know more about this story from reading that than I did the whole book. Because I can tell you that when I read Lord of Light, there was all kinds of neat sentences that didn't mean shit to me. The book was, I felt, like you said, Mark, I felt out to sea without a life preserver in most of this book, because so much of it depends on your knowledge of the Hindu mythology, which I don't know a lot about. And here's the thing about Lord of Light. I think it is probably a really brilliant book, but I don't know. Because I don't understand the level that Zelazny is working on. And for me, that made it an incredibly boring book to read and a slog, because most of the time it could have taken place in ancient India and I wouldn't have known the difference, because all this stuff about them crashing on another planet and stuff like that, I didn't even get that out of reading it. So tell me a little bit more about your experience of reading Lord of Light. Mark, was it better than mine?
Well, first off, I wrote this down on my notes. Really annoying is Zelazny's habit maddening of his sentences backwards writing. Seems he to think if his book this way he constructs, more spiritual and scriptural will it sound. And,
oh yeah, there was a lot of that.
Yeah.
And then you just end up skipping whole parts because you're just like, what on earth is going on?
Yeah, there was one point at once again I was reading a recent edition, so here's the copy I was working from, and about
that's the same one I read.
Yeah, about page 55, 56, Zelazny actually starts to explain, what the world is and how it got to be that way. And, all of a sudden I thought, oh, great, he's going to turn this around and, treat his story from a science fictional rather than a fantasy perspective, and the book is going to come alive for me. And then he went back to writing this fantasy.
It did not come alive.
As you said, it was like, is this a book about actual Hinduism? Is this a book about a reconstruction of Hinduism? Is it a book about, you know, the class struggle when, the ruling elite literally has the power of life and death over the population of, you get to be immortal, you get to die. Because there were some parts of it I liked, some aspects. Um, the dismissal of Christianity as the religion of the mutant sea creatures who don't emerge until the very end. Um, I liked the implied class struggle between the deists and the accelerationists of, well, do we give the masses some few crumbs or do we just, lord it over them completely?
Yeah, that was a really interesting part of the book that I was waiting for more on, because it was like, for little bits and pieces, you had some really interesting things where you're talking about the role of religion in advancing or not advancing a species, and that became really interesting. But it would be short bits, just like the short bits where they actually describe the world that you're in, and it was just not enough to carry me in this book.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the potential social criticisms in the story is the whole idea of religion that, really existing religions use the promise of immortality in some other world to persuade believers to do what the leaders of the religion tell them to. And in Lord of Light, the ruling elite is using the promise of actual immortality. This whole phrase, the real death, that if you don't do what we tell you, you're going to have to die the real death, the one that you're just not there anymore. And
Right.
that was one of the ideas I thought he could have done a lot more with, that I would have wanted to see more about. And
Yeah, and
also,
I definitely did appreciate some of those philosophical themes, but again, I felt like every once in a while, what would happen to me reading this book is I'd go, okay, here we go, it's about to get good, and no, it just wouldn't happen. We had great ideas that were just kind of right there. I definitely see why somebody would like this book if they were like way into Hinduism and stuff like that, or if they found that stuff interesting, but it just didn't work for me. Um, I do have a Zelazny quote about Lord of Light, and he said, "On one hand, I attempted to provide some justifications for what went on in the way of the bazaar. On the other, I employed a style I associate with fantasy in the telling of the story. I wrote it that way on purpose, leaving some intentional ambiguity because I wanted to lie somewhat between both camps and not entirely in either. I did this because I did not see much of that stuff being written at the time that fit that description, because I wanted to see whether I could do it, and because I was curious to see how a book like that would be received." So he was definitely trying to experiment with the form. And I think that the voters for the Hugo that year were probably rewarding him for that kind of experimentation. However, I can tell you, without even having read Delaney's The Einstein Intersection, which I definitely want to read, that book sounds way better. And it won the Nebula, and I will read it at some point, and then I will report back to everyone that it's better than Lord of Light, because I already know it is.
well, I had a similar experience with Lord of Light to yours. It was just a hard slog. It was a difficult book to read because it really didn't capture my interest. And if he had steered it more towards science fiction rather than fantasy, I'm sure I would have liked it a lot better.
I
Uh,
agree. That's what the book needed, to be more science fiction and less esoteric, or at least have chapters that hook you in with the science fictional themes that give it a little bit more real world feeling, and then you can experiment more with the other parts of the narrative. I think that would have worked better. I don't know how you feel.
in fact, after reading this, I thought that you and I had been way too hard on Robert Heinlein when we did the podcasts about his books. That he's a way better world builder than Zelazny, and for all of his preachiness, for all of his weird politics, Heinlein at least knew how to tell a story and knew how to keep your interest.
Right. I definitely would not have finished this book if we weren't going to be sitting right here talking about it, for
Eventually.
sure. Yeah, I don't think I would have finished it. I would have been like, hell no.
And yet, I ran into someone who saw me reading Lord of Light and said, "Oh, you're reading Lord of Light? It's a great book." And he said that he told me that I wouldn't really understand it until I read the ending, and then I'd have to go back and read the whole thing over again, and then it would make sense. And I thought to myself, once is enough. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't need to understand it that bad. Okay, so one of the most interesting things about Lord of Light is something that had nothing to do with the actual text of the book. And that is that in 1979, it was announced that Lord of Light would be made into a $50 million motion picture uh, by, and it was planned. It was enough that they had built sets for the movie, made a location, and the guy who was producing it even claimed that he was going to make a science fiction theme park in Aurora, Colorado, and they used designs by Jack Kirby, the famous comic book artist, who was hired to do artwork for the set design, and it got really complicated. And then the set designs were used in a very interesting way for a project that was known by the CIA as the Canadian Caper. Uh, Mark, are you familiar with what I'm getting at here? Do you know this part of the
Yes,
story?
I've read the. I think I probably read the same stuff on Wikipedia that you did. That it was the basis of the movie Argo and this whole plot that to free some of the hostages being held in Iran by sending a crew there posing as location scouts for a science fiction movie to be filmed in Iran.
Right. Which is way more interesting than anything that happened in Lord of Light. I'm not saying Argo is the best movie, but it's interesting to know that Lord of Light was the source material for the science fiction movie that they were trying to make in Argo, and that whole story. Yeah, I mean, I would say Argo is a better movie than Lord of Light is a book, but that's not really giving it that good of praise, I guess. Um, but yeah, that is interesting that that was Lord of Light was the book. I don't know if that ever translated into sales for the book. Probably people would have been pretty disappointed.
I will. I will say one thing on Lord of Light's behalf that I like the fact that it included transgender characters, even though once again Zelazny really didn't do much with them. It occurred to me that the first um, relatively modern fantasy involving a transgender character was written by Lyman Frank Baum, the creator of the Oz books. In some of the later Oz books, he had a boy named Tip become the Princess Ozma. And in Lord of Light, some of the characters are transgender, but it's only so that they can fulfill their assigned roles in the Hindu pantheon. That you can't have Brahma be female, for example. So she has to go FTM for that role, but she's disappointed that she can't have the sort of text she really wants.
Right. Well, there are some interesting elements and moments in Lord of Light. I think for me, the most interesting thing, or the thing that I would defend the book most on, is this idea of like, is it valid to progress the people, and how fast should religion be and technology be given to these people, or are they going to end up doing this to themselves again? Which gets into themes that we talked about when we did Miller's Canticle for Leibowitz. And so I think these are important themes that the genre was definitely exploring at the time. And so, I think in the end, my feeling is that Zelazny was doing something interesting and important with this book. It's just not for me. Just like I know Philip K. Dick is not for for all readers. I'm not saying everyone's gonna get out of reading Philip K. Dick what I do, and I certainly don't. Now, I had originally wanted my buddy Even to come on here because he's a massive Roger Zelazny fan. He grew up in Serbia, just absolutely loving Zelazny. Is his favorite author, loves the Amber books, but I just couldn't get the times right for him, and he would definitely be defending him. And I know the Amber books are really where he came into his own. I was kind of turned off on reading Zelazny forever, but I realized these are early works of his. Would you ever consider reading the Amber books, Mark? Or are you done with Zelazny after this experience?
I don't know. I mean, I had vague memories of reading some of his stuff as shorter pieces in the early 70s and liking them. I think partly that this was a very much a book of its time, the kind of hippie mysticism and, looking to India as a source of spiritual enlightenment. And, it just, it seems to me very much a work of its time that, in a way that, you mentioned Canticle for Leibowitz is not. It is something that holds up
right.
for all time.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are some people. I'm sure if we had more knowledge of Hinduism, that maybe Zelazny's working on a level that's really, maybe he's doing something really mind blowing. I know, for example, with my book, Vegan Revolution with Zombies, if you're an animal rights activist, you're going to get more from it than you would just being a general reader. And I'm assuming that if the person reading this book knows about Hinduism, it would work better or make more sense. And in that regard, I kind of wish I found somebody who was very knowledgeable about that to do this with us. But at the same time, a book has to function to a degree on a level that any reader can pick it up and read it. Otherwise, it's not working. And the fact that it didn't work for two serious science fiction readers, I think, really says something. I don't know. How do you feel about that, Mark? The idea that a book, should it be able to reach everyone, or is it okay if a book doesn't connect to some readers?
Well, I can go either way on that. I mean, there are people who write or make music or make movies that are very powerful for particular people, and the mass audience is not going to get. There are some people who try to go for the mass audience and can't. They just work on too creative or profound or just alienated a level. I mean, I think Zelazny was the quote you read, that he was trying to bridge the worlds of science fiction and fantasy and create something that would appeal to readers of both genres. I don't think he did that, but it's an interesting try. I think the attempt to come together with that has become a lot more common now than it was then. So, but then we were talking about Dune earlier, and Dune is a beautiful mixture of science fiction and fantasy. That's where the whole thing works. That it is Lord of the Rings, but it's also a space opera.
Right.
The last, that really does seem to have been beyond Zelazny's talents, or maybe his interests.
Yeah. Well, so bottom line for both these books, I'm going to give this Immortal 3 out of 5 vegan death rays. But I kind of liked this Immortal a little bit more than I did Lord of Light. And, I think it's somewhat worth reading, but it doesn't hold. It should not have won with Dune. It's ridiculous that it forever be tied to a book that is incredibly superior. So, Mark, how would you rate?
Far more. Dune, a book that attempted far more and achieved far more than this Immortal.
Right.
And, Lord of Light, I mean, I was, coming to it after the disappointment of this Immortal, and my God, this is even more dated and more dull and, more frustrating in the occasional flashes where he could have taken the story to much more interesting places than he actually did.
I'm going to give Lord of Light 2 out of 5 Hindu arms.
Okay.
And that's really all I can. I don't really know what else to say about it. Do you want to give a rating for both books, Mark? Starting with this Immortal.
I think I'm fine with that. I'm not really big into rating systems, although once again I think we're very unfair to Robert Heinlein when we gave him 2s out of 5. So because Heinlein's books, as many problems that they have with them, Stranger in a Strange Land and The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, were both far more interesting, far more entertaining, far more readable, and far more professional than either of Zelazny's books that we've talked about.
And better discussion.
Heinlein had a lot of ideas. A lot of them were really dumb, but at least you could talk about them. Zelazny is like, okay, what are you trying to say here? With all your backwards sentences, trying to make it sound like you're writing scripture.
Right. Okay. You know what this means, guys? We get to close out the 60s here for the Hugos. We're done. This is it. Bye-bye 60s.
One thing about both of Zelazny's books that we've talked about, Lord of Light even worse, is how many different names he comes up for his characters. It's like, towards the end of Lord of Light, there's a sentence where he actually gives all the central characters' names. It's like, well, it would have been nice if you'd done this earlier so I would have known who you're actually talking about.
Oh, I know. It was a total mess. It was an absolute mess.
Like, who is Tathagata? Oh, it's the same guy.
Yeah. All respect to Zelazny and what he did. I'm sure the Amber books are far better. I'm just not sure I'm going to find out, to be honest with you. All right. Mark Conlan, thank you for joining us.
And thank you for
keep it paranoid.